Hey there and welcome to Ryan's History, where we will be going over the Gilded Age, and in this video I will be going over the various reform movements that sprang up during this time. So without further ado, let's get into it. So in this video we are trying to do one thing, and that is to explain how different reform movements responded to the rise of industrial capitalism in the Gilded Age. When I say industrial capitalism, here's what I mean. Now, if you've been keeping up with the rest of Unit 6, you'll remember that America was undergoing a massive change in the way that it produced goods to be sold. Like back in the old days, artisans and skilled laborers crafted items by hand to be sold on a small scale. But during this period, factories sprang forth from the ground like Athena from Zeus's head, and within these factories, tens of thousands of unskilled laborers worked machines day in and day out, mass-producing goods to be sold on a national and international scale. One of the economic realities that allowed them to grow so quickly was the prevalence of laissez-faire capitalism, and this just means that the American government intervened very rarely in economic operations of business, and so without many regulations, these businesses flourished. And when I say these businesses flourished, what I really mean is that most of the wealth they generated stayed in the hands of the elite upper class. For those working in the factories, it was a whole different story altogether, like their wages. In many cases were only barely enough to survive, and add to that the exceedingly dangerous working conditions, and then add to that the 12 to 14-hour days that meant that when you go to work in the dark, you return home in the dark, and then all of a sudden you got a whole sector of society who are eking out a miserable existence. So in light of all this, artists and critics, which included agrarians and utopians and socialists and advocates of the social gospel, they all rose up and demanded reform, and let me introduce you to some of their causes. Henry George, who was a politician and an economist, thought it was downright foolish that so much wealth could be generated by a nation, while at the same time so many of its citizens lived in abject poverty. His solution was called the single tax on land, and according to his estimates, those elite folks who owned large tracts of land were gaining disproportionate amounts of wealth based on the increasing value of that land, and therefore they simply needed to be taxed more to even the playing field between them and the working class. Okay, let's switch over to the utopians. A good example of an artist using utopian art to challenge industrial capitalism was Edward Bellamy. He wrote a novel in 1888 called Looking Backward, in which a man goes to sleep in 1887 only to wake up in 2000 and find that America had been transformed into a socialist utopia where capitalism had been crushed and everyone's needs were met. Anyway, speaking of socialism, that ancient enemy of capitalism, this ideology really gained some traction during this time. It's easy to understand why people gravitated toward this ideology according to the dictates of socialism. All the means of production in a society should be owned and regulated by the community and benefit everyone more or less equally. And looking around at the state of society in the late 19th century, it is understandable why some people might think capitalism had failed. Anyway, socialism picked up some steam during this period, but it never really grabbed hold of American citizens like it did to Europeans. However, if you remember, Eugene V. Debs was the head of a significant union talked about early in the unit, who was joined with a few others and started the Socialist Party of America in 1901. He ran for president on this party's ticket, but they did not do so well, and they basically petered out after this. Others who opposed industrial capitalism did so under the banner of the social gospel. Christians in America had always believed that repentance and reform ought to be applied to one's own soul, but here the focus grew wider. The advocates of the social gospel believed that Christian principles ought to be applied not just to oneself, but to cure the ills of society as well, and in that vein, throughout the last 20 years of the 19th century, many Protestant preachers crusaded for social justice for the urban poor. They especially set their sights on the middle class and urged them to take up the mantle of solving urban poverty as their Christian duty. So the point of all this is that there were a lot of folks who tried different methods to resist the kind of society that industrial capitalism created. Now during the same time, there was another reform movement brewing, but had less to do with capitalism than everything I just said. Women especially took up the cause of reform during this period, and they did so for various causes. Jane Addams, who established settlement houses to help immigrants assimilate to American culture, was one of the causes, but also there was a big push for women's suffrage during this time. In 1890, Elizabeth Cady, Santa and Susan B. Anthony founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, which worked tirelessly to secure the franchise for women. but their work did not bear any constitutional rights until 1920. During this period, women also took up the cause of temperance, which is the fight against the consumption of alcohol. To combat the impoverishment of the working classes, women formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874, and their goal was total abstinence from alcohol. And apparently it was a popular message because it had 500,000 members on their rolls by 1898. This organization, along with others like the Anti-Saloon League, worked largely through peaceful means like protest and trying to lobby Congress to pass laws. There's a more radical strand of women who refused to wait for the painfully slow gears of Congress to turn, and maybe the best example I can think of is Carrie Nation. She said of herself that she was a bulldog, running along at the feet of Jesus barking at what he doesn't like. And apparently Jesus didn't like alcohol because what Carrie Nation was known for was her hatchet, which she carried into saloons and hacked at liquor barrels until they spilled all their contents onto the floor. And that sums up everything you need to know about Unit 6, Topic 11. Thank you for listening. This is Ryan's History, out.